And this is Dre, and I want to welcome you back to my channel if you've been here before, and if it is your first time, then welcome. So on today's video, I want to talk a little bit about procurement requests, and specifically on the different types of requests that there are. So as organizations look to incorporate more technology into their environments, they often look to the vendor community for options and to bring forth some solutions to needs they've identified. So for many, the purchasing process requires that they follow some complex procurement guidelines. So there are some very strict rules about who you can purchase from, how you can go through the process, what the actual steps are, and how everything should work. So these procedures are in place to make sure that the process is competitive, that it's efficient, that it's transparent, and that it, above all, is ethical. So it's also to make sure that the process is fair and that the purchaser is going to get the best solution they can from the open marketplace. So in general, larger organizations tend to go through these formal procurement initiatives, and government agencies or any organizations that are spending public funded or taxpayer funded dollars are also required to go through these processes. So one of the things that comes up fairly frequently when people start to talk about the procurement process is all of the different request types that actually exist. So today I want to go over 8 of them. So this is not an exhaustive list, but I did try to capture the ones most frequently used in the healthcare environment, and I'll go through on the subsequent slides and give you a bit about sort of what this particular request type is, as well as what type of information you would need to issue one and what you'd be looking to accomplish out of the actual process. So let's go ahead and dive right in. So first up is a request for information. So this is pretty straightforward. It is exactly what it sounds like. And the goal here is for the issuing organization to understand more about the capabilities and the products that are available in the market to resolve an issue or need that they have. So it is typically part of a multi-stage procurement process, so it doesn't actually end with this request for information. And the information that is supplied to you by the vendor community once these are issued can be utilized in later requests. So you can take the information that you learn and incorporate it into something further down the road. So requests for informations are primarily done when the organization is able to define what they need. So they know what the issue is or what their general goal is, but they're looking for different solution options. So they need to understand what's out there and what are the available options from the vendor community. So the responses as they come in, and these are timed, so they do have sort of an issue date and a respond by date. So the responses are reviewed in detail, so they go over them quite closely, but they're not formally evaluated, so they're not compared or ranked against one another. And at the end of an RFI cycle, a contract is not awarded. So the intent is not to enter into a purchase agreement. It is just to gather more information. So the second one is a request for expression of interest. So this can also just be referred to as an EOI or expression of interest. And this is primarily to gauge interest in the vendor community about an opportunity that is pending. So there's something coming down the pipeline and you release an RFEI to see sort of what the vendor appetite is and whether or not this is something that is going to garner enough responses, whether there's information there, and what type of reaction you're going to get from the community. So it again is part of a multi-stage procurement process. It is not intended to result in a contract in and of itself. It is something to gather more information and to sort of assess the landscape. And you can use the information that is obtained in an RFEI for the future requests. So the organization, when they issue these, they are able to articulate their need and they can identify some of the purchase criteria, but they're looking for more details and more options from the vendor. So they want to know, is there interest in supplying something like this? Is there capability out there? Sort of what does this look like? It is important to note that this particular cycle doesn't pre-qualify or shortlist vendors. So the responses are reviewed, and they're reviewed in detail, but they're not formally evaluated against one another. So there isn't a shortlist that's created off this process. One of the other times that this process can be used is if there is a significant opportunity that's coming down the pipeline, so something that's very large in magnitude, and an RFEI can be utilized to sort of notify the vendor community and allow them some time to form consortiums, so they can form groups to respond to that larger one. So RFEI information can come in sort of in pieces, and it gets the organization's vendor community talking. So next is a request for supplier qualifications, or RFSQ. This is also known as just a request for qualifications, but I've found over the years that more and more organizations are adding the term supplier in there just to differentiate. So there is another request type that abbreviates to RFQ, and we'll talk about that in a bit. So for this particular purpose, I'm going to refer to this one as an RFSQ. So the RFSQ round is one that does pre-qualify vendors for a large-scale opportunity. So the request document that goes out defines a minimum or baseline criteria and qualifications that have to be met by the vendor community, but the intention is to create a shortlist or to pre-qualify someone for a subsequent or larger opportunity that's coming down the road that relates to this RFSQ. So it is part of a multi-stage procurement process. This is usually one of the first steps. So an RFI may have been issued prior to this, but this is not intended to result in a contract in and of itself. It is meant to sort of narrow the field and make sure that when you go to a subsequent round that everyone has pre-qualified. The other reason that this is done, so you're looking to pre-qualify and to narrow the field, in particular if you've got a very large field that you're expecting to respond and you want to make the final sort of contract intending round quicker. So you want to make that more efficient. This allows you to sort of narrow the field in a funnel type approach. So the organization that's releasing an RFSQ will need to be able to clearly define what it is that they're looking for and what the required qualifications are for the vendors. So this is meant to have a potential elimination criteria with it. So it doesn't mean everyone has to be eliminated or everyone will be, but the option is available there. So you have to be pretty clear in defining what it is that you're looking for. Responses in an RFSQ are formally evaluated. So they are compared very diligently against some response criteria, and providers are ranked. So there's a minimum threshold they need to meet. If they do meet it, they can continue and they may bid on the subsequent round. If they don't meet the threshold, then they are not allowed to continue. You'll see these done sort of more and more in large, very, very complex type procurements. So if an organization with multiple hospitals, multiple outpatient clinics or ambulatory centers, or is across multiple states or multiple cities in a province, is looking for a single vendor to replace their EHR. So something that is of that magnitude. It's also done a lot in construction projects. So the next one is the other RFQ that I mentioned, and this is a request for quote. So this is also sometimes referred to as an invitation to quote, an ITQ, or an invitation for bid, which is an IFB. So my little acronym at the bottom, that last Q should be a B. So a request for quote is something that you would issue as an organization once you know exactly what it is that you're looking for, that you've got all of the detailed requirements and criteria outlined very clearly, very easy to understand by the vendors, and terms and conditions have been defined. So proponents that respond for requests for quotes, they are going to be evaluated and ranked solely on price. So the requirements are articulated in such a way that there isn't wiggle room on them. So this is exactly what we're looking for. And this is how you're going to respond, and I'm going to, as the organization, rank based on cost. So these are best for standardized type services, so things where there's a very, very clear set of specifications. You're looking for a particular quantity, you're looking for something that can be provided by multiple suppliers, and you're just looking for the best option. So an example that I can give you is for the purchase of hospital gowns, for example. So they can be made by many different people. They're very straightforward. They all come in different sizes, different colors. You can specify all of that and look for the quote. So the next one is a request for a standing offer. So an RSO is used to identify vendors who can provide products on an as-needed basis. So the RSO will actually result in an agreement being formed. So it's not a contract, but it is an agreement that when called upon, the vendor organization or the supplier organization will provide the goods or services at a predefined price against prearranged terms and conditions. So there isn't a contract in the actual RSO itself. The contract is created once the request is made to sort of call up, as it's referred to, those products or services. So a lot of organizations who have multiple sort of serial type needs for things that are very consistent can set up RSOs for a variety of things, whether they be for products or for services. So I've seen RSOs created for staff augmentation. I have seen RSOs for project management, professional services type work. I have also seen RSOs for supply chain equipment. So things that are just called upon in an as-needed basis, and you want to know ahead of time before you call it up what the terms and cost will be. So the sixth one is a request for tender. So a request for tender is an open invitation to the supplier vendor community to respond with their ability to meet the needs of that tender. So you need to be able to clearly define what it is that's needed, as well as the detailed criteria that you're looking for. So the difference between this and an RFQ, or the request for quote, is that the responses in an RFT are evaluated on price and on qualitative factors. So it does not just come down to price. It also incorporates qualitative factors, but you need to know exactly what it is that you're looking for so that evaluation can be fair, transparent, and open. The organization will award out the contract at the end of this process. So these are done, again, when there's very, very clear guidelines and specifications, but when it is not going to come just down to price. So a request for proposal, or an RFP, is probably something that many of you will have heard about. And this is one of the most complex methods of procurement request. So this involves an organization who is seeking a partnership with the vendor community or a consortium of suppliers. So they're actually looking not just for a single request and response. They're looking for an actual partnership over time. So these tend to be fairly long agreements or fairly long contracts. A lot of them have renewal options that are incorporated. And when they're written, some of the criteria and solution requirements may be known, but exactly how to solve the problem and what very, very specific sort of solution outline that you've got is left to the vendor community to respond to. So they're looking for information on the solution process. Both the short-term and the long-term goals of the organization are articulated in the request, And that, again, is because they're looking for a partnership with the vendor. So they're looking for something sort of to grow and evolve over time, and they want to make sure that the vendor that is the successful proponent is going to be able to do that. The opportunity may have a prior stage. So this is something that may follow an RFI, an RFEI, or an RFSQ round. So there may have been the narrowing of the field in the shortlisting prior to this RFP. So a formal evaluation is completed. There are typically 3 areas that are evaluated as a sort of a large grouping, and that's mandatory requirements, so requirements that must be met by the supplier or vendor. There are ranked components, so those are the qualitative or sort of ranked from a scoring perspective in an instance where the solution hasn't been articulated very clearly with a criteria, but the vendor is coming to the table with a solution. So there are rankings that are associated with that, and that is evaluated. And then pricing is also evaluated. So RFPs are also sort of detailed in such a way that things like personnel and financial stability and economic viability, things like that can be incorporated into RFPs. So at the end of an RFP process, the organization will award a contract. And one of the important things to note about the RFP process is the RFP document itself, the request that goes out to the vendor community, as well as the successful respondent's answer to that, or their response package. Those become part of the contract agreement. So the details on what you were asking for, as well as the details on what they said they were able to provide and for how much, that all becomes part of the contract. So these are very, very complex and can take sort of an extended period of time to get through, but are very, very useful and definitely are helpful for organizations seeking partners. So the last one that I want to talk about is something in healthcare that's fairly new. So it does exist in other industries and has been around for a little bit, but we're seeing more and more of this come up in the healthcare environment just in the last few years. And that is a negotiated request for proposal, so an NRFP. So it has some similar characteristics to the RFP that I just described, but it involves a lot more collaboration and dialogue. So this is a multi-staged approach. Again, it can be preceded by something like a request for information or an RFEI. But the main sort of point of this one is the organization that's issuing the NRFP, is able to define some of their needs, but they are open to the possibility that they can't define them all. So it falls into that category of you may not know what you don't know. So this is something that has evolved in the last few years, primarily because technology is changing at such a rapid pace that for large-scale organizations and government entities, it's very difficult for organizations to sort of stay on top of everything that's out there and to rely on internal resources to know exactly what options there are available. So an NRFP allows you to go through a multi-stage cycle where the responding vendor community can actually help inform you of what is out there, so you can incorporate that into your request. So if they're doing something and have the ability or capability of achieving something that you didn't know existed, you probably would have never asked for. Actually, you wouldn't have asked for it. So this gives you the opportunity to learn about something that's out there and to make a determination whether you want to incorporate it or not. So there's iterations that go through here. So it's a very open process. There are at least 2 rounds, sometimes 3 or 4, where an NRFP is issued, responses come in, those responses are reviewed in detail, and then information is taken from those responses and information is gathered by the vendors, and they sort of inform each other's components, and then a subsequent NRFP with more details and more parameters or more clarification is actually released. So the other way I think about this one is if you look at some of the RFPs that have gone out in the last 5 years, let's say, the number of addendums that actually go out with them seems to be growing. So there's more and more questions and more clarification required on the vendor side. And a lot of the questions that are coming forth to the organizations were things the organization never even thought about. And it's because they didn't know that things were changing that quickly. So this allows you to sort of work through that to form a true partnership. So again, a detailed review is done with each of the earlier rounds, and you incorporate things as you go. There is a final round that goes out. So there is one final NRFP document that goes out, and the vendors that are participating in the process are allowed to respond to that final request. And typically those are evaluated using a BAFO process, so best and final offer, and they are then ranked against each other, and the organization awards the contract to the vendor who has the highest score in that ranking. So these are evolving and will continue to do so for the next several years, but I think we're going to see more and more of these NRFPs, and I think a lot of them will actually follow some of the other RFIs and things like that. So that is the sort of top 8 that have come across my work life and my clients have utilized in the last, I'd say, 10 years. Again, not an exhaustive list, but certainly the ones that come up most often. So I thought this quote was actually quite good in decision making like coffee needs a cooling process. So if you are involved in one of these procurement cycles, you know exactly what that means. So if you like what you see, then feel free to subscribe, enter your comments below. Also let me know what other things you'd like me to talk about, and enjoy the rest of your day.